My namesake, the most heroic thing you ever saw, the connection between football practice and typing class, cave-in, armfuls of dirt, grace under pressure, a bid for attention. What are you trying to do? My dad had a favorite coach. His name was Sherman McCord. Sometimes he says I was named after him. Other times he says I was named after a guy he was friends with in college, who's now a painter in New York City. Other times he says I'm not named after anybody in particular. My namesake seems to depend on his mood, what he is valuing at the particular time the origin of my name comes up. When he references Sherman McCord, his mood turns nostalgic and reverential. "What's the most heroic thing you ever saw?" Hyter asked once at dinner. It was a family tradition to ask questions around our meal and keep asking them until we happened across a line of stories that would lead somewhere satisfying. Sometimes we went through 10 or 15 questions. If you were an animal, what would you be? Or if you could interview any dead person from history, who would it be? Were typical ones. I remember once we even got into the subject of murder, much to my mother's discomfort. If you could kill someone at any point in history and get away with it, who would it be? Hyter asked. I took the obvious and acceptable way out and killed Hitler. Hyter took the honest into my mother's spooky route and killed his 4th grade teacher. Dad killed John Wilkes Booth. Mom wouldn't even think about honoring such a dark question with an answer. Sometimes it took most of dinner to get to a good question, but that day Hyter asked about the most heroic thing we'd ever seen. Dad responded immediately. One September day, he started, the whole football team was in typing class together. Typing, I asked. That doesn't seem like something football players would be into. They weren't, Dad admitted, poking a baked potato off the serving plate in the middle of the table and putting it on his own. We were all really bad typists, if I remember correctly. How's typing heroic in any way? Asked Hyter. It's like secretarial work. It's not heroic, said Dad as he split his spud open with a knife. But if you let me tell the story, I'll get there. For a few seconds, the only sound was the clinking of plates and silverware. So, Dad said, when we seemed ready to listen, we were all in typing. He nodded toward the salt and pepper shaker beside Hyter, who passed them across the table. We were all in typing because Sherman McCord had insisted on it. You see, the rule was that the teacher who had you for your last class could excuse you at the end of the day when your work was done. And he knew the typing teacher, this old guy named Donovan Smith, who had yellow fingers, he smoked so much. And he knew old Donovan didn't take teaching typing all that seriously. So, we football players would all get in there and get Donovan's typing exercise finished in 10 minutes, and then we'd head out to the football field. Seems like they'd have rules against that, said Hyter through a mouthful of green beans. Don't talk with food in your mouth, Mom said. Hyter made a face, and I thought Dad would give him a little lecture, but he was too deeply into his reverie. They did have rules against it, but the rule was that practice couldn't officially start until after school. So McCord didn't do any coaching. He just left the balls and the equipment we used out there so we could use them if we were so inclined. And he gave our seniors a plan to follow if they were so inclined. He ended up getting an extra hour of practice in every day. What's heroic about that? I asked. I'm still getting there, said Dad. He began shaking pepper onto his potato. One day we were all in typing. There was a crew outside digging a ditch to run a water pipe out from the school to the field. This was back in the 50s, and they weren't using any heavy equipment. It was just a bunch of men with shovels sweating it out, digging that 6-foot trench out from the school. Sounds miserable, Hyter said. Another pork chop? Asked Mom. We're in there tapping away at our typewriters when we hear shouting coming from where those men are working. Cave in, they yelled. There's a man under there, someone said. And there was. One of the workmen. He'd been absolutely buried alive. 6 feet of dirt on top of him. Dad sat back in his seat to tell the story better. And, he broke into a big smile, it was just like Sherman McCord. Just like him. To be walking out with those bags full of footballs right then and there. What'd he do? I asked. McCord was one of those men. You know how strong they are just by the way they look. He'd never gotten in our drills, so we didn't really know how strong he was, but he was over 6 feet tall and at least 200 pounds. We were all scared to death of him, even though he was kind of old, nearly into his 60s. We all believed he'd be able to toss us around like rag dolls. He was that kind of strong you don't see much anymore. He was that strong you get from working on a farm all your life from when you're just a boy. You couldn't see every little muscle on him the way you can with athletes today, but he was every bit as strong as any of them. Dad took a drink of his milk. "Don't stop eating," said Mom to Hyter and me. "Don't let it get cold." "Yeah, but what do you do?" asked Hyter as he picked up his fork. "Well, we all jumped out of our seats and ran outside. Some of us to see a disaster, some of us to help, and some of us just because everyone else was running out of the room. And we got there about the same time McCord did. Couldn't have been 20 seconds after the cave fell in, and those workmen were just standing there. They were just staring down where their 6-foot deep hole had been less than a minute before. Only now it was only a foot deep. There were 5 feet of dirt on that poor man. And then McCord shouted, 'Dig!' at all of us, the kids, the workmen, and that broke the spell. In just a second, dirt was flying everywhere." "Obviously he didn't die," said Hyter. "The story wouldn't be very heroic if he did." "No, he didn't die. Sherman McCord saved his life. It couldn't have been much longer than 2 minutes before we hit his chest, then dug out the rest as fast as we could until we uncovered his face." "I'll never forget," said Dad, and there was a glint in his eye when he said it, "the way that man's breathing sounded when we got that dirt off his face. It was almost a howling noise he made. Getting the oxygen out of the air, he was howling in reverse." Dad picked up his fork again. "Sherman McCord dug most of that hole himself. He was throwing it out of that ditch in armfuls. The rest of us were just scraping away at it." Dad stabbed at a bite of potato. "If it hadn't been for Coach McCord, that guy would have been dead. I guarantee that." "That's pretty good," said Hyter. And Hyter was tough to please. "You know," he said, always the bore, "in English we learned Hemingway's definition of courage." "What's that?" asked Dad. "Grace under pressure," said Hyter. Dad stuck his bite of potato in his mouth. "That's not bad. Sounds like they're teaching you something worthwhile on that brick-walled monstrosity after all." "Sometimes," said Hyter. "Sherman McCord doesn't sound much like Vidstein," I said. "Coach is a good coach," said Hyter. "He's good at getting your runners to eat their radios is good. He's good at letting the seniors try to tape us to trees at morning practice is good." "What's all this?" asked Mom as she leaned over and stuck a pork chop and dropped it on my plate. "Eating a radio?" said Dad. He laughed. "Someone on your team ate a radio?" "And he cries a lot," I added. "How come he cries?" asked Mom. She hated to hear about people being sad. She sounded sad herself when she asked. "It doesn't sound much like Sherman McCord to me," said Dad. "Not much grace under pressure in crying in most cases. Crying's usually about surrender, no other option." "Vidstein's broken down in front of most of the guys," I said, pretending to be disinterested, as if Martin Vidstein was barely worth the breath required to talk about him. But I had Dad's full attention. I could tell. His brow was knit. He'd put his silverware down. "He told one guy he was going to kill himself," I said, remembering Bowden's comment on the ride to the Hokum Karam. The room was still. Hyder's eyes were wide. The food in his mouth went unchewed, as if he'd forgotten he'd just put some in there. "This sounds serious," Mom said quietly. "He sounds like he's got some real issues." "He sure does," said Dad. He picked up his napkin and wiped his mouth. "Does Dr. Billings know about this?" "I don't know," I said. "I'd probably better talk to him about that," said Dad. Later, as my brother and I were getting ready for bed, he whispered to me as we brushed our teeth side by side in the bathroom. "What are you trying to do? Get Coach fired?" "Yes," I said.